with that for a long time, and at first I started going to creative writing workshops and doing all of those kind of things that, again, academics do. You kind of try and upskill in order to be able to do this. And I guess that did help to some extent. But what was intriguing about these stories that my mother told were the silences that surrounded the stories, the things that I didn't understand, the things that I hadn't asked her about, either because you just don't talk about those things between mothers and daughters, or because it never occurred to her to talk about something, and I never realized I needed to ask until sometime after, until I was thinking about this whole thing. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going off into my process. So that's how I eventually came to realize that in order to write my mother's stories, I needed to put myself into this story as well. And that's where the whole issue of place begins to take an actual character within the book. Place becomes part of the story. It becomes part of the way in which my mother, in my case, and myself have shaped ourselves, have come to make meaning, sense of our lives, is in relationship to the landscapes and the places that we've been through.
In fact, I'm going to talk about memoir writing tomorrow, and a lot of what I am going to say, you have just said. My situation is quite different from everybody else's, and I've been quite interested in the last 2 days when people have been talking about what it feels like to be Maltese abroad, how Catholicism has been so much a part of their identity. I'm an outsider as a Maltese because I'm Jewish, and as you know, the Jewish community of Malta was and always has been very, very tiny. My surname, Tayar, is not a part of that very limited pool of Maltese names, so that whenever I say to people I'm Maltese, and they ask me my surname, they always respond, oh, but that's not Maltese. So although my family has been living, or has lived in Malta since 1846, when my great-great-grandfather came to Malta as the first post-Inquisition rabbi on the island, my relationship with Malta is, I think it's a double exile, because I'm an exile in Malta, but I'm an exile as an Australian. I actually don't live in Australia. I grew up in Australia. I was educated there. I left when I was 21. My home is in the UK, but my work is in Brussels. So that sense of belonging that perhaps people who are Catholic, who are born in Malta have, I don't have. On the other hand, the 2 books I've written, Malta has been a very important character in the story. So I think it's part of my mental landscape as well. I always think of the way my aunts thought of the Maltese. The Maltese were always spoken of, and my aunts were born here. My grandmother was born here, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. They were always spoken of in the third person. The Maltese do this, but we don't do that. On the other hand, if somebody criticized the Maltese, they became deeply, deeply Maltese and deeply offended. So that a film like Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail, they found that absolutely outrageous and offensive, as if they were Christians. And they couldn't imagine how anybody could have made such a film about the life of Christ. So this is my dilemma.
We move now to Maria's TV.
I'm so tempted to go off script now and talk about my migrant experience. I'm doing that tomorrow, but it's just important. It struck me. I'm here in a university that my grandfather and my father were laureates of, and I have never been to university. My son has a degree, and my first husband has a degree, But in order for that to happen, I had to die. Nobody cares who your grandfather is. Nobody cares what your father did. Nobody even cared that I edited journals here, that I got my first byline as a journalist in 1978 here. That's a long time ago. They don't care. You become completely nothing. It's like the myths where you pass through the doorways, and at the final doorway you take off your last ring, your last piece of jewellery, and you go through naked. And it's after 30 years there that you both begin to remake yourself, which for a writer is a real privilege, because you finally get to bedrock about yourself and not all the stories that other people think about you, which, wonderful as they are in Malta, and much as I miss that, as a writer it's much, much better to be blank. And the other thing about it is that if you've lasted that long, well, you've got it in you to perhaps have what it takes in the publishing world today, which we all know is not that simple. Before migrating to Western Australia, I was viscerally connected to my birthland. Wherever I was, and at any time of the day or year, I relied on an unwritten map. It was inner, three-dimensional and haptic. I felt where I was, the way we're aware if we are standing upright or lying down, of our location at any given moment when in our own house. I had a tactile sense of Malta's position as the main island of an archipelago, and I had such a connection to those rocky fragments that I appreciated where they were situated in relation to each other and the neighbouring Mediterranean coastlines. In Malta, through an accumulation of particulars which radiated beyond the horizon and perhaps began their imprint even before I was born, I could read the island fluently and still know, whenever I return, every place. I don't mean merely that I recognise their names, but I have a profoundly geographic sense of them. From any town, village or hillside I can picture the nearest coast's intimate details, whether it banks gently down to aqua shallows in bare limestone flanks, or falls sheer, high chalky cliffs festooned with caper bushes, crumbling to shadowy shale slopes and wine-dark water. It's embodied, it's ancestral. Islanders understand the geology of the ground beneath their feet through stories still handed down from a time when survival depended on knowing the ways it's seasonally irrigated, all the winds and gales to which it's exposed, how their litany of names begins. In Malta it was Schlock, Regal, Maestral. On waking each morning before opening my eyes, the clarity of bells pealing in the next village or the feel of sheets damp with humidity would tell me if the weather was coming from nearby Sicily or from Libya, which lies to the south. At day's end, wherever I was, I anticipated the exact spot on the horizon where the sun would set. I read my island in 8 directions, and even blindfolded could have told you which valley we were in by the texture of its rocks and soil, the scents of wild mignonette and orange blossom, or those subtle gradations of salt tang on a breeze, which sharpens from creek to open sea. I no longer live in that landscape, the ground of my writing. At the age of 34, I moved to Western Australia. Just before I left, my first poetry collection had been published and favourably reviewed. I was described as obsessed with the natural world and primeval elements of her familiar Maltese landscape. In Perth, though I continued to work as a journalist, my creative writing withered. The nature in nature writing comes before the writing, and in this unknown land I was environmentally illiterate, bereft of my former connection to country and sense of place, which had bound me to my island and inspired my poetry. I needed a long apprenticeship to Western Australia, and more than that, to a specific local place, and to those who read it as a poem. Unfortunately, as it is for so many migrants, our first decade here was hard work, and we spent our rare recreational time with other Maltese Australians. Years were to pass before I would meet the guides to come, those who knew the layered implications of endemicity. I had taken such guidance for granted in Malta, where my mother and grandmother passed on the island law in the course of daily life. We would talk about growing seasons and crop cycles while gardening or planning and preparing meals. There was hardly any division between countryside and towns, and the mild Mediterranean climate made us all outdoors people. The habits of the few hardy local trees, carob, fig, or idiosyncratic details of place, like the desolate hilltop that was always perfumed with wild narcissus on Good Friday, that's Concezione, were linked to our favourite family picnic places and the religious calendar. Whether you loved or loathed the popular local sport of shooting birds, you knew that migrating waterfowl flew over Camino Channel after Easter. The influential birdwatcher journal Wingspan describes the archipelago as a vital migratory stopover, but also a notorious killing field. Maltese hunters allowed to legally shoot a few species, but in practice, every bird within range is free game. And there's footnotes to that, there's lots of footnotes to this. So in autumn, I waited and watched as migrant raptors reached the ridges and high cliffs of the western coast. In late summer, from August to October, the Maltese feast on fish they call lampuki, known elsewhere as mahi-mahi, dorado or dolphin fish. Large schools find shelter from the fierce sun under rafts which fishermen make from palm fronds, then tow far offshore in calm weather, a canny method of entrapment learned by generations of fisherfolk. In Malta's valleys, along with the surround sound of crickets and the anguished braying of donkeys, there's the familiar creak of rickety windmills, which I was told had been introduced to the island last century by a migrant returning from Australia. My blood ran soil, as a student of mine once put it. But until I moved away, I was unaware how vital that was to my creativity. In Western Australia, though I marvelled at the diversity, the scale and beauty of the landscapes, I nursed a profound disorientation. 14 years would pass before I sent another